Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen: Shame, Stereotypes, and Black Women in America. We are on page 157. We are officially halfway through the book. We are beginning to read a segment entitled Social Disaster: The Duke Lacrosse Case. In March 2006, players from the Duke University lacrosse team hired Crystal Mangrum, an African-American woman and a stripper, to perform at a party. Afterward, Mangum alleged that several players had forcibly raped her. Mangum was a black single mother who attended North Carolina Central University, NCCU, a historically black college also located in Durham. She alleged that members of the team victimized her verbally and physically, shouting racial epithets before forcing her into a room where she was sexually assaulted by several of the young men. Shortly after she made her statement to Durham police, Ryan McFadden, a member of the lacrosse team, sent an email to fellow party attendees claiming he wanted, quote, to have some strippers over. I plan on killing the bitches as soon as they walk in and proceeding to cut their skin off while coming in my Duke issue spandex, end quote. McFadden's emails was cited in a probable cause affidavit issued by the Durham County Courts. After this email was released to the public, the Duke lacrosse coach resigned, the university canceled the team's remaining games, and many in Durham's community took the content of the email as an admission of guilt and an indication of a pattern of violent imaginings about black women. Within days, Durham's district attorney, Michael Nafong, filed charges and made press statements assuring the public that he has strong evidence of the players' guilt. Durham's African-American community organized in support of the alleged victim. The story became national news and stayed on the front pages of local papers for more than a year. By 2007, however, everything had changed. The alleged victim was thoroughly discredited. Physical and DNA evidence cleared the young men of any sexual misconduct. The accuser's history of drug use, sexual promiscuity, and mental health problems was made public. Michael Nafong lost his job as district attorney and was ultimately disbarred for his aggressive handling of the case. The city of Durham was named in a lawsuit brought by the team members and their parents, alleging that the young men have been deeply scarred, professionally hampered, and financially strained by the false charges against them. The case and its handling by the media have multiple layers of race, gender, and class meaning. Town gown relations between majority white Duke University and predominantly black Durham, anxieties about moral debauchery among elite college athletes, questions of institutional inequity between predominantly white and historically black colleges, concerns about trial by media for high-profile criminal investigations, issues of prosecutorial misconduct brought on by political ambition. All of these subjects and more were fodder for journalists, bloggers, scholars, and workplace conversations. The case is also emblematic of the multiple ways in which shame operates in race and gender politics. As the story of alleged sexual assault was unfolding, a group of 88 Duke University faculty members took out a full-page advertisement in the campus publication, The Chronicle. The ad, titled, quote, "What does a social disaster sound like?" end quote, included quotations from several Duke University students who indicated that as women or as racial minorities, they regularly experienced alienation and harassment on campus. After presenting these students' views, the advertisement asserted, quote, "The students know that the disaster didn't begin on March 13th and won't end with what the police say or the court decides. Like all disasters, this one has a history, and what lies beneath what we're hearing from our students are questions about the future," end quote. The ad clearly expressed these faculty members' sense that issues of race and sexual violence were ongoing concerns on campus. Although they never stated that the lacrosse players were guilty of rape, the piece demonstrated that these faculty members did not view their primary allegiance as resting with the accused students. Instead, it implicated the known actions of the players, the party, hiring a stripper, sending the email, as participatory actions in a larger social disaster. Part of the text read, quote, "We are listening to our students. We're also listening to the Durham community, to Duke staff, and to each other." Regardless of the results of the police investigation, What is apparent every day now is the anger and fear of many students who know themselves to be objects of racism and sexism, who see illuminated in this moment's extraordinary spotlight what they live with every day. They know that it isn't just Duke, it isn't everybody, and it isn't just individuals making this disaster, but it is a disaster nonetheless. End quote. Okay, let's have a reflection there. I think what the first thing that stood out, or that the first thing that I was thinking about as I was reading through this, is I was recalling this moment in time, and I do remember this story. I didn't follow it very well. I was in high school when it happened, but I do remember this being a continuing story. I also remember some of the rhetoric that was around it. I, as I'm reading this, I think about two other books that I read that spoke about Black people's experience on college campuses. One of them was Black Power by Kwame Ture, and I can't remember the other name of the other author that was involved in writing that book. But they talked about the experiences that Black people faced on campuses, on college campuses in the South during the Black Liberation Movement during the late 60s, uh, during the mid, basically during the 60s, and the prejudice and discrimination that they dealt with from the communities and the cities that these colleges were in, and then on these college campuses as well, especially the Black people who were some of the first people to be integrated into these colleges. There also was, I also think about the book They Can't Kill Us All, where I think it was in college in Missouri during or close to the time that around the time of the murder of Michael Brown and the uprising in Ferguson. They spoke about the experiences that they were having on campus and some of the racism that existed there. And I have never been to college personally or been to university personally. I went for, visits for like parties or stuff like that. But there is specific institutions and specific portions of our society that have historically been known for the amount of racism that exists within them. And the education system from elementary school to middle school to high school to college is something that has been pervasive with racism. Even from the thinking about the fact that, Black people weren't allowed to go to certain schools. And and when they began to integrate these schools, there was always a struggle and a fight that ensued as Black people began to try to go to these places for education. And so it's not a surprise to hear about this experience and to learn more of the details in this experience. We've read in this book and in Women, Race, and Class how often the concept of rape and sexual violence is dismissed when the woman is Black and the person doing the accused is, or the person who is being accused of it is white. And so this is, again, reading about this social event and reading about the political implications, the psychological and the philosophical implications and the race implications that exist within these events. And again, this is just another highlighted example of why we have to have an important understanding of intersectionality, because this event is not one that just was about sexism, and it's not one that just was about racism. It was about the intersection in which those meet, and how there's a portion of people who opt into the ideology of sexism, and so that leads to victims of sexual assault being misrecognized. And then there's a portion of our society that opts into racism, which leads women of color and Black women who have sexual violence to them being misrecognized. And then when those things are combined together, it leads to even larger portion of the society misrecognizing Black women going through these events. All right, let's keep on reading. Less than a year after Hurricane Katrina revealed patterns of festering racial inequality and prompted national conversations about Black citizenship, these 88 members of the Duke faculty chose to frame the lacrosse scandal as a disaster. In the long shadow of Hurricane Katrina, this choice is an important clue to the multiple meanings associated with the rape accusation. In this context, disaster evokes a sense of unequal vulnerability to supposedly neutral processes. The faculty members were drawing a link between the abandonment of black citizens in the aftermath of Katrina and the sense of vulnerability that many black men, white women, and especially black women felt on Duke's campus. The levee breach drew national attention to inequality in New Orleans. The faculty hoped that the rape accusation could be the impetus to discuss racial and gender inequality on elite college campuses. The case did draw national attention. In January 2007, CBS conducted a national survey as part of its ongoing political polling. The survey asked about George W. Bush's performance as president and about the war in Iraq. It gave support for Democratic primary candidates Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and it asked about a number of current political issues. Among these were questions about the ongoing Duke lacrosse sexual assault case. A full 58% of those questioned were following the case very or somewhat closely. This does not approach the level of attention that Americans gave Katrina, but it shows that the case had drawn a broad audience of interested Americans. By the time of the survey, in January 2007, only 26% of respondents believed that the three accused players had probably committed a serious crime. But when asked if race had played an important role in the case, 17% said that it was the most important factor, and another 27% said it was a contributing factor. Americans were paying attention to the Duke case, and a substantial minority saw it as a case with racial implications. The poll also showed significant racial differences in how closely individuals were following the case, their presumption of the players' likely guilt, and their beliefs about the role of race in the case. A slightly higher percentage of African American respondents were paying moderate or close attention to the case, 61% of blacks versus 57% of whites. Nearly half of black respondents, 46%, believed that the Duke players were likely guilty of a crime, while fewer than 1/4 of whites, 19%, agreed with them. Also, nearly 30% of African Americans responded that race was the single most important factor in the case, more than double the number of whites who felt this way, 14%. These gaps in racial perception of the case resemble the patterns of racial difference in perceptions of Hurricane Katrina. That race was central to the national conversation about the case suggests that the faculty were, in a sense, correct in trying to frame the issue as a race and gender disaster. Their characterization took center stage in the months following the initial rape accusation and the eventual determination of the lacrosse players' innocence. 88 faculty in several departments signed a document, but the most visible and vocal organizers were Wanima Lubiano and Carla Holloway. Excuse me if I pronounced that wrong. Both are tenured black women in Duke's Department of African and African American Studies. Both have spent their academic careers studying and writing about black women's history, literature, and contemporary lives. They understood themselves as uniquely positioned to offer insight about the case by framing it for the campus, the community, and the nation. After all, this is part of what liberal arts professors do. They help their students to contextualize contemporary experiences within larger intellectual frameworks. But as Crystal Mangum's story unraveled, these professors, along with others of the, quote, Duke 88, end quote, became the objects of public harassment and ridicule. I think that's a highlightable section right there. I'm trying to grab my pen. Oof, okay. These sentences here. Let's see. After all. Okay, I'm going to repeat it. So still got to get a highlighter, but using my pen to mark the spots that need to be highlighted. On here. After all, this is part of what liberal arts professors do. They help their students to contextualize contemporary experiences within larger intellectual frameworks. And I think I'm definitely not a liberal arts professor, but I do think that is something that we're trying to do with Rockford Reading. And I think that's something that we have to do as a black community and as people who are advocates against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We have to be able to contextualize contemporary experiences within larger intellectual frameworks. Okay, so let's keep reading. It is impossible to understand why Hurricane Katrina evoked racial shame for so many Black Americans without understanding the historical context of slavery and Jim Crow. Similarly, to understand the Duke faculty's decision to describe the events of March 2006 as social disaster, it is important to place the Duke case within a broader history. Historian Daniel McGuire's award-winning essay in the Journal of American History recounts the horrific story of 4 Black college students returning from their college formal at Florida A&M University on the night of May 2nd, 1959. The students were pulled over on a lonely road by a group of armed white men who threatened all of them, and after a struggle, abducted and repeatedly raped Betty Jean Owens. McGuire calls the Tallahassee trial, where an all-white jury convicted Owens' attackers, a watershed moment in U.S. history. It became a flashpoint for Black community organizing in the town. It revealed how rape, like lynching, was a form of social terrorism, and it was one of the first times the power of the state was used to protect Black women from white male assailants. Quote, "We all felt violated, male and female. It was like all of us had been raped," end quote, reported one FAMU student involved in the massive protest that accompanied the trial. Thousands of students marched to City Hall, considered violent action, and made clear their determination to protect other Black women from violation. For many, the accusations in the Duke lacrosse case evoked a long history of white male violence against Black women. Historians remind us that white male slaveholders forced enslaved Black women to have sex partners they did not choose and to bear children for profit. Some even raped their bondswomen or allowed others to sexually assault them. Historians have also documented how, in the Jim Crow era, when many Black women were relegated to domestic labor, they were routinely assaulted, harassed, and violated by white male employers. And historians suggest that just as Black men were motivated to flee the lynch mob violence of the South, so did Black women, during the Great Migration, seek relief from the sexual assaults that were an accepted practice. This historically documented sexual exploitation and abuse was the initial framework many Black Americans used for contextualizing the charges against the Duke players. Like the students of FAMU and the community of Tallahassee, the NCCU and Durham communities mobilized immediately with community vigils, campus protests, letters of solidarity, fundraising efforts, and statements to the media about their determination to hold the assailants responsible. The community not only focused on the accused, but engaged in conversations about race, privilege, inequality, and vulnerability. The African American professors and their white faculty allies at Duke who signed the advertisement were hoping to map the broader social and racial context for the alleged crime. Their sentiments echoed the FAMU student who said, quote, "It was like all of us have been raped," end quote. This is the first time, maybe I have read about this FAMU story before and I just don't recall it. And that's one of the reasons that it's important to be regularly reading these different pieces of literature to get into to get these events to imprint on your mind and to be able to recall them and to be able to remember them and remember the implications around them. But again, I did say that as I was reading this, it made me think of different books I've read where these type of racist experiences were pointed out or were highlighted by the authors. And so it's not a surprise to hear about this. I thought what was important here was, or something that I think is a highlightable section here is historians here, right here. And historians suggest that just as Black men were motivated to flee the lynch mob violence of the South, so did Black women during the Great Migration seek relief from the sexual assaults that were an accepted practice. Yeah. I felt like it was another thing I wanted to. Okay, and then another. It became a flashpoint for Black community organizing in the town. It revealed how rape, like lynching, was a form of social terrorism. Social terrorism. I think that's an important section that should be highlighted as well. And to me, both of those sentences just do the job of illustrating the the way that this racist ideology, this Jim Crow ideology, manifested on black women as opposed to how it may have manifested on black men. And it should, and this is something that have done the job of pointing out, and I'll try to remember to continue to do. Just as black men were the predominant group of people who were lynched in the black community, there were also black women lynched, and just as black women were the predominant group of people who dealt with sexual violence at the hands of white racists, there were also men who dealt with these things as well. And so I just want to make sure I do point out that I understand that both of those things are true. All right, we're going to try to read a couple more paragraphs for this episode, and then we'll end this episode and we'll start back tomorrow and probably complete this section within Chapter 4, Disaster, of Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. Let's continue reading. In Chapter 2, I pointed out several instances when African American public opinion sided with black men accused of sexual assault rather than with the black women who were their victims: Mike Tyson, Clarence Thomas, R. Kelly. The Duke lacrosse case was dramatically different. The alleged abusers were not African American, but white males from a privileged, predominantly white institution. Whereas Anita Hill and Desiree Washington had no access to an easily available trope to counter the lynching metaphor deployed by their black male abusers, Crystal Magnum's accusations evoked a history of black women as the sexual victims of Southern white men. Mangum thus benefited from a swift response by local and national black communities, who instantly recognized the historical trajectory of her story. The Sunday after the allegations, a local group called Black Women together to stage a, quote, pot banging, end quote, a noise-making protest of banging pots and pans in front of the home where the lacrosse party took place. Quote, we are having a casserolazo. Never seen that word before. Quote, we are having a casserolazo, or a pots and pans protest, because it is a tool women all over the world use to call out sexual assaulters. Y'all, a sister, an NCCU student and a mom of two, has been brutally assaulted, and we need to get together and make a big noise, end quote. But with the release of the DNA evidence and mounting concerns about Mangum's inconsistent story, it became clear that the Duke case was not a repeat of the FAMU event or another example of white men's abusive exploitation of African American women. This young black woman had lied about being raped. The legal and community institutions that had leaped to her defense ended up baffled, hurt, and angry. Her lies reinforced centuries-old assumptions about African American women by evoking the painful Jezebel myth. They silenced and shamed many black women around the country who had defended her. Most critically, because the Duke 88 had used her alleged victimization as a way of talking about continuing realities of race, violence, and vulnerability, her lies undermined the credibility of those broader arguments. Excuse me, I had something to drink. Not only did this case evoke these shameful, centuries-old misrepresentations of black women's lasciviousness, it also prompted painful memories of the more recent case of Tawana Brawley. In November 1987, 15-year-old Brawley accused 6 white men of rape. Brawley's body was covered with dog feces and scrawled with racist epithets. Her clothes were burned and torn, and she seemed profoundly traumatized. The men she named as her assailants included police officers and a New York State prosecutor. Her story, like that of Crystal Mangum's, provoked immediate outrage and elicited high-profile support among African Americans. The Reverend Al Sharpton became her advisor, championing her cause in the media and using her allegations as a way to discuss racism among police and city officials. Respected comedian and social commentator Bill Cosby donated and raised money for her support and legal fees. Hundreds in her hometown marched to support Brawley and protest racialized sexual violence. But in October 1988, the New York grand jury released an extensive and damning report indicating that Brawley's story was fabricated and that she was personally responsible for the abhorrent condition in which she was found. Black feminist legal scholar Patricia Williams writes poignantly about the power of the Brawley case to shame and silence black women. Quote, "Wild black girl who loves to lie, who is no innocent," in New York television quote, "Wild black girl who loves to lie, who is no innocent," in New York television newscasters inadvertently but repeatedly referred to her as the, quote, "defendant," end quote, and whose wiles are the downfall of innocent, jaded, desperate white men. This whorelet, the symbolic consort of rapacious, saber-rattling, buffoonish black men asserting their manhood. Tawana's terrible story has every black woman's worst fears and experiences wrapped into it. Few will believe a black woman who has been raped by a white man, end quote. As Crystal Mangum's story unraveled with spectacular similarity to the Brawley case, it evoked the same shaming anxieties. On one level, the Duke lacrosse case is straightforward. A woman lies about being sexually assaulted. The young men she accuses are assumed by both the press and the legal system to be guilty. A powerful institution bends to the public assumption of guilt and collaterally punishes an entire group of young men associated with the accused. The legal system eventually exonerates these young men. In the aftermath of the findings of innocence, the false accuser and those who uncritically assumed her honesty are subjected to public ridicule, just as they had earlier subjected the innocent young men to ridicule. This is, in many ways, an accurate way to recount this complicated episode. But I want to suggest that the case also gives us a chance to explore some messier interactions among race, gender, and shame in the context of a social rather than natural disaster. Okay, I think we're going to end this episode here, or at least that'll be the last portion of this book that we'll read for today. And what stands out to me about those passages is the similarity in the cases of Mangum, Crystal Mangum, and Brawley to the case of Jussie Smollett. And Jussie Smollett did not accuse the people of sexual assault or any type of sexual violence, but he did make the accusation that white men wearing MAGA hats, wearing Trump hats, tied a noose to his neck and wrote a racial slur on him and called him racial and homophobic slurs. And he was eventually accused, and when he came out, there were portions of the community that supported him and portions of different communities that didn't support him. There was, I remember being a conversation amongst the black community about people not supporting him, and it being tied to homophobia in some cases, and that, of course, there's no absolutes, but there was definitely times where the intersection of racism and homophobia interacted with the reactions to Jussie Smollett, claiming that he had been accosted and had this racist attack perpetrated on him. But as time unfolded, it would be accused that, these was all false allegations. He would eventually be charged for these false allegations, stand trial for false allegations, and then be found guilty of basically obstruction of justice and a couple other charges. And in these other cases that we read through here, it doesn't seem that any of these other two women were taken to court, taken to trial and convicted in the same sense that Jussie Smollett was. But that also lends to the status that he had as a celebrity and the times that we were in during when it took place. And so I say that to say that I think it's important to be able to see these common themes that take place and these commonalities that happen. They speak about history repeating itself and history being in cycles. And so I think it's important to be able to identify similarities within the cycle. in an effort to try to sometimes explain things, even if you can't necessarily alter it, still be able to explain it and communicate about it. Okay, so we're going to end this episode here. Please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of Rockford Reading Daily, and we will continue to read Chapter 4, Disaster, of Melissa V. Harris Perry's Sister Citizen.